Have you ever pondered the origin of nationalism and how it has shaped the world as we know it? Let's take a journey back to mid-18th century Europe, where you'll find a landscape vastly different from the one we know today. Back then, there were no nation-states as we understand them. Instead, what we now know as Germany, Italy, and Switzerland were a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and cantons, each with rulers presiding over their autonomous territories. Eastern and Central Europe housed a diverse array of people under autocratic monarchies. These people didn't see themselves as a collective identity or sharing a common culture. Often they spoke different languages and belonged to different ethnic groups. The Habsburg Empire, which ruled over Austria-Hungary, is a prime example of this diversity. It was a patchwork of many different regions and peoples, from the German-speaking aristocracy in Bohemia to the Italian-speaking provinces of Lombardy and Venetia, and the linguistically divided Hungary. Amidst this diverse setting, there was a dominant class, the landed aristocracy. They owned estates in the countryside and townhouses, speaking French for diplomacy and high society. Their families were often intertwined through marriage. However, this influential class was numerically small, with the majority of the population being the peasantry. As we move towards Western and parts of Central Europe, we see the emergence of a new middle class, thanks to the growth of industrial production and trade. The rise of industrialization, which began in England in the second half of the 18th century and later spread to France and parts of the German states, led to the creation of new social groups. These included a working-class population and middle classes made up of industrialists, businessmen, and professionals. These classes were smaller in number in Central and Eastern Europe until the late 19th century. At this point, the concept of a nation-state was still a distant idea, but the seeds of change were being sown. The ideas of national unity began to gain popularity, particularly among the educated, liberal middle classes, following the abolition of aristocratic privileges. And so, the dawn of nationalism began. So, how did the notion of nationalism and the nation-state begin to take shape? Well, let's take a step back and look at the social and political landscape of the time. The aristocracy, with their estates and townhouses, were the ruling class, while the majority of the population was made up of peasantry. However, the growth of industrial production and trade led to the emergence of a new middle class, a class composed of industrialists, businessmen, professionals. This educated, liberal middle class started to question the status quo. They began to see the potential in a unified nation, especially following the abolition of aristocratic privileges. Ideas of national unity became increasingly popular within this group. But why? The answer lies in the ideology they embraced, liberalism. The term liberalism has its roots in the Latin word liber, meaning free. For these emerging middle classes, liberalism stood for freedom for the individual and equality of all before the law. They believed in a government by consent, not by imposition. They were pushing back against autocracy and clerical privileges that had been the norm for centuries. In essence, they were advocating for a society where individuals were free to pursue their goals, where every person, regardless of their background, had an equal opportunity under the law. This ideology, with its emphasis on individual rights and equality, was a stark contrast to the autocratic monarchies and diverse ethnic groups that characterized Europe at the time. But what does all this have to do with nationalism? Well, the ideals of liberalism provided the philosophical underpinning for the rise of nationalism. As people began to embrace the idea of individual freedom and equality, they also began to see the value in a unified nation, a collective identity, a shared culture. They started to imagine a nation-state where they could live free and equal, a place they could call their own. So, in a nutshell, liberalism, with its emphasis on individual freedom and equality, played a pivotal role in the birth of nationalism. The stage was now set for a transformation that would redefine Europe and the world. Let's take a giant leap from the mid-18th century to the 19th century, the era when Europe's map started wearing a new look. The diverse kingdoms, duchies, and cantons began to see beyond their autonomous territories, beyond the different languages they spoke and the various ethnic groups they belonged to. They started to identify as a nation, bound by common cultural, linguistic, and ethnic ties. This marked the growth of nationalism, a concept previously alien to the diverse groups. The Habsburg Empire, for instance, began to unite under the banner of nationalism, despite its patchwork of regions and peoples. The powerful force of nationalism was not just confined to the borders of a single empire, but spread across Europe, redefining its political landscape. Nationalism, once a distant idea, had now become a powerful force, shaping nations and redefining the world.